It's a great pity that I cannot attend the workshop on site. But anyway, many thanks to Lucia, Xin, Mark, and all the others who work hard to make this workshop happen. And so Haiping and Shuangyi's talks are related to intermedial body and in modern art or contemporary art in China or the world. In my talk, I would like to invite you to travel back to visit the ideas of intermediality and physicality in classical Chinese poetics. So let me see. So a general abstract compared with the aesthetics of mimesis and representation that has prevailed in Western poetics since Plato and Aristotle, classical Chinese poetics represented by concepts like chuanshen, qiyun, shengdong, shenyun, etc., has been regarded as being more spiritual and metaphysical. But by re-examining the evolution of a classical Chinese aesthetic theory, my talk intends to review the physical aspect of Chinese thought and argues that the spiritual ideals of Chinese poetics, that is intermedial and transmedial across the work of art, are rooted in the subjectivity and the creativity of human body. Some physical concepts like xin, heart, qi, breath or energy, gu, bone or skeleton, jin, sinew, even rou, flesh, along with wei, taste or flavor, have been applied effectively in the classical Chinese interart and intermedial poetics. So my talk consists of two parts. Firstly, I'd like to make a somewhat simplistic comparison of Western poetics and Chinese classical poetics. Secondly, I would like to review the physical aspect in classical Chinese poetics in different ages. So firstly, we know that since the day of its birth, poetry has been inseparable from other forms of art. A Chinese scholar, Zhu Guangqian, pointed out in his essays on poetry that judging from the evidence of anthropology and sociology, quote, poetry, music, and dance are of the same origin and originally a trinity of integrated arts, end quote. Like the poetry, dance, music of ancient Greece originated from the worship of Bacchus, and the ancient Chinese ode was a mixture and a combination of song, dance, and music. So we can say poetry is also closely related to painting as its sister art. So as the essence of poetry can be said to be interart and intermedial, the essence of poetics is also interart and intermedial. So in this level, Western poetics are similar to Chinese poetics. But generally speaking, Western, or we say European interart intermedial poetics can be traced back to the ancient Greek philosophical works. In Book 10 of the Republic, Plato proposed an onslaught on painting and poetry as imitative art, producing representation or a copy of the copy of what is truly real, the form. Then in Poetics, Aristotle agrees that poetry and music, quote, in most of their forms are all in their general conception modes of imitation. Then in the Roman period, the statement related to sister arts is best exemplified in Horace's Art of Poetry as uta pictura poesis, a Latin phrase literally meaning as is painting, so is poetry. So since then, this phrase has been prevailing in Western poetics until the 18th century. when Lessing argued against the homogeneity of poetry and painting in his Laocoon, and stressed on the distinction of poetry as the art of time versus painting as the art of space. Since then, Lessing's theory of the heterogeneity of poetry and painting has produced far-reaching impacts. And then by the 19th century, in tune with the Romantic movement, the Poetics of haute musica poesis, the homogeneity of poetry and music began to prevail, reaching its peak during the Symbolist movement, as illustrated by Wat Peter with the proposal that all art tends towards the realm of music. Zhu Guangqian summarizes the Western interart poetics precisely in his essays on poetry. I quote, "To emulate painting poetry is easier to focus on imitation and fall into realism. To emulate music in poetry is easier to focus on self-expression and fall into romanticism." This distinction, though a little bit cliché, is fundamental. As Coleridge put it well, one is born either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. We can extend this saying to that. A poet is born either attentive to painting or to music. A poet is either keen on the objective reproduction or on subjective expression, end quote. And comparatively speaking, the classical Chinese poets are more keen on expressing one's emotion and aspirations. And the classical Chinese poetics has evolved early from the homogeneity of poetry, that's poetry like music, as stated, like the poetry speaks of aspiration, the song prolongs speech. And this philosophy or this idea of aesthetics can be considered the dominant tone of the ancient Chinese poetics. However, in the Han and Wei dynasties, the poetries of Shi and Fu diverged, as reflected in Lu Ji's Wenfu, the art of writing. Shi, a lyrical poetry, traces emotion daintily like music, while Fu, the rhyme prose, depicts scenes brightly like a painting. The writing of Chinese poetry diverged in two general directions since this period. One followed a line of fusion with music, including poetry's styles, 乐府 poetry, 永明 poetry, 律诗 poetry, and 词 poetry. Meanwhile, the other line followed the popularity of more descriptive and pictorial poetry, like 山水 poetry, poetry about mountains and waters, and 拟物 poetry, poetry on the description of scenes, and 拟物词, in which there was fusion of full writing into poetry, representing the poesis of haute pictura poesis. However, the division of poetry like music or poetry like painting does not fully apply to Chinese poetics. Classical Chinese poetics has been influenced by Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And after the Wei and Jin dynasties, and particularly since the Tang and Song dynasties, the idea of poetry like Can, or we say Chan poesis, emerged. With the influence of this poetics, the poetry may emulate the music, but it does not represent the overflow of powerful feelings. Joy, instead, on the inspiration from objects and the transcendence of self and objects. And similarly, the poetry may emulate painting, but it does not simply copy the reality, emphasizing instead conveying meanings beyond the representations. Moreover, traditional Chinese literati had a more holistic artistic view and did not strictly differentiate the forms of art, unlike the more competitive mentality of Western artists since the Renaissance. Even some modern scholars, such as Wang Guowei, Zhu Guangqian, to name a few, who were influenced a lot by Western aesthetics and had sense of artistic classification, still have paid more attention to and emphasize the interaction and integration of art and literature. Now let's review the evolution of classical Chinese aesthetic theory to review the embodied physical aspect. First, let's read some poetics in very early China. And we'll find there's a fusion of poetry, song, music, and dance in the poetics of this period, from the antiquity to Han and Wei dynasties. In ancient China, the so-called music, yue, had a wide range of contents, like musica in Greek. Poetry, song, music, and dance are usually considered as a unity. The so-called music, yue, also refers to joy and pleasure, le. So actually, these two characters are homographs. And from the etymology of this character, and we can find this word indicates the musical instrument, the qin, the strings made of silk on the wood. So this is a very pictorial character. So anything that brings joy, le, to people and satisfies their senses can be broadly referred to as music, yue. In the book of documents, so anything that brings joy, le, to people and satisfies their senses can be broadly referred to as music. In very early book of documents, it is recorded as that in antiquity, Emperor Sun appointed Kui as the music director, teaching noble children and defining the origin and function of poetry and music as follows. I quote, "The poetry speaks of aspirations, the song prolongs speech, the melody follows the lyrics, and the tone harmonizes with melody. The 8 musical genres complement each other, no clashing or outdoing each other, bringing harmony between gods and humans." So responded to the instruction of Sun, Kui responded by saying, "I strike the stones and the beasts dance." Of course, this stone is not an ordinary stone. It's a kind of a stone musical instrument. So from this, we can imagine the harmonious state of poetry, music, and dance in ancient Semitic music, which is also the earliest source of saying poetry speaks of aspirations. Then during the Zhou and Qin dynasties, from 11th to 3rd century BC, Semitic music transformed into ritual music. And Confucius regarded ritual music as fundamental for governing the country and maintaining peace. In Record of Rites and Music, compiled by some Confucian disciples, the origin and essence of music is elaborated, as music is generated from interaction of human heart and nature. And poetry and music were again interpreted as an integrated physical activity. I quote, therefore, the song is a kind of speech, a speech of long notes. To say something when speaks. When speaking is not enough, one makes a long speech. When a long speech is not enough, one sighs and cries. When still not enough, one cannot help waving the hands or stepping the feet, end quote. And then the earliest collection of Chinese poetry, 诗经, or the Book of Odes, or the Book of Poetry, indicates the writing of the early forms of Chinese poetry. And we can find the etymology of 诗 related to mouth, to speaking, okay? And like 乐 and 武 also very physical. This is a song related to mouth, and 武 a man is dancing with some animal tails. So in the great face to the book of poetry, to 诗经, this is the preface is regarded as the first dedicated exposition on Chinese poetics. It reflects the understanding of the nature and function of poetry in the Han Dynasty, which is derived from a long-standing tradition that goes back to very early tradition recorded in the book of documents that we read just now. The great preface retains many elements of music criticism, and it is based on the logic of poetry like music to understand the physical and literary mechanism of poetry, echoing the musical ideas recorded in the record of music. I quote, poetry is the utterance of one's aspiration, which flows from one's heart and transforms into words. When words are not enough, one sighs and cries. When that is not enough, one sings. When singing is not enough, one cannot help waving the hands or stepping the feet. So in the Poetics of Antiquity, the physical initiation of the writer or singer or dancer were foregrounded, and particularly as depicted in Lu Ji's Wenfu, the rhyme prose on literature. So in this selection, we can find the physical representation of the writer before he started to writing. As time is short, so I omit the quotation. Then in the early stage of, if we say the early stage of classical Chinese poetics was dominated by the idea of poetry like music. After the Wei and Jin dynasties, the development of poetry, calligraphy, painting, and music theory was flourishing, and different arts borrowing techniques and aesthetic notions from each other. Extended from the understanding of music, Chinese people like to view poetry and works of art as living organisms, believing that they can be compared and attached to the human body, and that arts such as painting, calligraphy, and poetry can communicate with the body and engage in aesthetic communication. It is best illustrated by Liu Xie in his claiming in Wenxing Diaolong that all writings should adhere to the principle of, quote, emotions and thoughts as the spirit, subjects and meanings as the marrow, rhetoric and style as the skin, and tones and tunes as the voices and oral, end quote, treating writing as if they were human bodies. As is mentioned before, the writing of Chinese poetry diverged in two general directions. One line of poetry being more musical and the other being more pictorial and descriptive. In the poetics of poetry like music, the concept of qi, breath, air, or energy, and xin, heart, are frequently applied. And we know that in the book of music, the concept of qi is already put forward to refer to the life and vigor of music. Likewise, Cao Pi stresses on the literary qi in a discourse on literature, as he claims that I quote, in literature, qi is a dominant factor, and qi has its normative forms, clear and murky. It is not brought by force. And just like music, even if the melody is balanced and rhythm is consistent, and when it comes to controlling the qi, the skillfulness and the simplicity is very important. Okay. And the xin, heart, is also an important factor in music and poetry, as in the notion of qingxin, musical heart, or shixin, poetic heart. The most important and systematic monograph of Chinese classical poetics is Liu Xie's Wenxin Diaolong. It is usually translated into the literary mind and carving of dragons. But in fact, the literal translation should be the literary heart and the carving of dragons. And then in the poetics of poetry like painting, the concepts, some physical concepts of gu, skeleton or bone, rou, flesh, jing, sinew, are often applied, apart from a very important concept of qi. For example, in Zhong Rong's raking poetry, he borrowed the concept of fen gu, that is burn skeleton, from a painter's exposition, Liu He's the record of the classification of old painters, to appreciate Cao Zhi's poetry with gu qi qi gao. That means gu, burn, and qi are very high. So the concepts of burn and qi are interconnected. Burn refers to the burns of gu, refers to the burns of person, which determine the structure of their body, whether strong or weak. Qi refers to a person's emotions and character, corresponding to the strength or weakness of their body. So Zhongrong's application of the concept is to command Cao Zhi's poetry in his pursuit of noble ideals and grand temperament. Some physical notions are interchangeable in the criticism of painting and calligraphy also. For example, Jing Hao, a painter as well as a critic in Tang Dynasty, argues for 4 momentums of Jing, Rou, Gu, Qi in his book of Notes on Brushwork. And I quote, Jing, sinew, is to describe the potential for shanshui painting, shanshui, waters and mountains painting, to extend from the foot of mountain to the summit. This potential is continuous, despite the presence of smoke and clouds in the middle. Rou, flesh, is to describe the undulation of the terrain, which constitutes the basic pattern of shanshui painting. Gu, bones, is to describe the preeminent and towering posture that defines mountains as mountains, while qi refers to the organic unity and integrity within the brushwork and ink of shanshui paintings. In the similar manner, Lady Wei Yue elaborates on gu, rou, and jing in her criticism of calligraphy. I quote, those skilled at imparting strength to the brush have much burns strong structure, while those not so skilled had much flesh. Calligraphy with much burn and a little flesh is called a shenyun. That which has much flesh and a little burn is called ink pig. Writing that displays great strength and the richness of shenyun is sage-like. That which has neither strength nor shenyun is defective. End quote. So we found the notions of some physical concepts are very similar in criticism of painting and calligraphy, as etymologically painting and calligraphy look very similar, with the holding of a brush, the same instruments for creation. And then let's explore the poetics of poetry and Chan. As early as the preaching era, the Confucian aesthetics founded by Confucius and Daoist aesthetics constructed by Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi formed the main framework of Confucianism and Daoism complementarity in ancient Chinese aesthetic thought. Then, around the end of Western Han Dynasty and beginning of Eastern Han Dynasty, Buddhism was introduced to China from ancient India. It was promoted during the Southern and Northern dynasties and reached its peak in the Tang Dynasty. So after Buddhism came to China, the Chan aesthetics that's naturalized Buddhism became another branch of classical aesthetics. This is what Li Zehou calls the fusion model of Confucianism, Daoism, and Chan. So after the Wei and Jin dynasties, monks and literati, men of letters, had very close contact. Many monks were also literati, and many literati studied Buddhism and Chan carefully. So in this way, Chinese poetry, calligraphy, painting, and music were integrated into philosophy of Chan and the aesthetics of Chan art. As far as poetry criticism is concerned, the idea of wood Chan poesis has gradually developed, especially in Tang and Song dynasties, represented by concepts like chuanshen, qiyun, and shenyun, with much stress on the spiritual and the metaphysical aspect of poetic creation. However, if we scrutinize the other significant concepts like ping, wei, and wu in the poetics of wood Chan poesis, we will find that the more stress is put on the physical and subjective imitation of the reader's view. So if we explore these characters to the origin of the writing, and we found the mouth in ping, and the tongue in wei, and the heart in wu. So firstly, from the etymology of these three characters, physical aspect is indispensable to the understanding of these notions, with mouth, tongue, and heart included. Therefore, Zhongrong's Shiping, although with Ping, but in Zhongrong's era, it just refers to the evaluation of poetry, which classify poets into high, middle, and low ranks, while Sikongtu's 24 Shiping is about different flavors, different styles of poetry. And one way is an exemplar Chan poet or painter in Tang Dynasty, while Shu Shi, the Song scholar, made a very classical comment on his poems and paintings for their vivid imagery, Chan significance, and very artistic appeal, well known to many Chinese. 谓摩诘之诗，诗中有画；观摩诘之画，画中有诗。It means tasting one with poems. There are paintings in the poems. Gazing at one with paintings, there are poems in the paintings. In other words, to understand the Chan significance, paradoxically, one needs to wei, savor, to taste, and one needs to guan, gaze, and one needs to meditate, wu, so as to achieve the epiphany and enlightenment of truth. So these concepts highlight the active role of the readers of poetry or artistic creation. To conclude, there is a strong corporeality in classical Chinese poetics and aesthetics that have been overlooked by many modern scholars. By re-examining the evolution of classical Chinese aesthetic theory, this talk reveals the physical aspect of Chinese aesthetics and argues that the spiritual ideals of Chinese poetics, that is intermedial and transmedial across the works of art, are rooted in the subjectivity and creativity of human body. Firstly, the physical initiation of the author and artist was stressed in antiquity when poetry, song, dance were fused into music. Secondly, the physicality of the artist, like qi, jing, gu, qi, xin, gu, jing, and rou, had been believed to be transferred to the works of art in the interart intermedial poetics since Wei and Jin dynasties. Last but not least, in Tang and Song dynasties, when the poetics of homogeneity of poetry and Chan prevailed, the transmedial concepts of Ping, Wei, and Wu underscored the physical and subjective initiation of the reader or viewer. Therefore, compared with Western readers, Chinese people are more critical of the personality and moral character of the author or the artist, because they believe that, like a father, like a son, the artistic creators will transform their physicality and spirit into their creation and beyond. Thank you very much.